Welcome back, everyone, to the sessions on digital in global value chains and trade. In these sessions, we have very special speakers from ADB, led by Joseph Maria Singham. He is lead the data development and statistic in the system of national accounts, global value chains, and statistical business registers. He leads many dynamic teams, and two of representatives in that team will be the speakers for the sessions today. We have, could you please turn the camera on Anurag and Jam. Anurag and Jam are both consultants in the Asian Development Bank. They both specialize in global value chains and digital economy. The team, which is led by Joseph, now conducting very interesting research to capture, measure digital sectors in output and global value chains and trade systems. So we invite the team to share the knowledge with us today, and then we will see from there how we could use this new knowledge in our research and policy recommendations. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Vitala, and I'll take the first half of the session, then my colleague Jam will continue in the second half. I'll share my screen first. Just a minute. Yeah, I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can see.
All right, thank you. So good morning, afternoon and evening, everyone who are joining from different countries right now. And thank you all for joining. The objective of today's session is to identify digital industries and discuss Asian Development Bank's framework to measure digital economy and understand how digital goods and services are embedded in global value chains. The session also highlights how an economy's process of digitalization can be affected by changes in trade policies. The study presented today is based on the Asian Development Bank report, Capturing the Digital Economy, a proposed measurement framework and its applications, published in August 2021. So let's get started. Our flow of discussion for today will go as follows. I'll begin with first defining the core of digital economy and then discuss our framework to measure digital economy. Following this, I'll present an overview of the main results of our study to understand the size and growth of digital economy and its role in trade and global value chains. And after the presentation, which should be for around 40 to 45 minutes, after that, my colleague Jam will walk us through the assignment which was shared with the participants in advance to understand our measurement framework further. Defining digital economy. The term digital economy is believed to have been coined by Don Tapscott in his 1996 publication entitled The Digital Economy, Promise and Perils in the Age of Networked Intelligence. From this book, both researchers and practitioners have picked up the terminology digital economy and generally used it to refer to the value of transformative digital goods and services. The exact definition of digital goods and services and the exact way to measure its value, however, has not reached to a consensus among professionals. The various definitions of digital economy have varied in concreteness and differed in classification systems. Our study adds to the discourse in two ways. The first is by proposing a narrow and concrete definition of core digital goods and services. And the second is by outlining a consistent measurement framework that is rooted in a value-added based calculation. Taken together, the proposed framework defines digital economy as the contribution to the GDP of any exchange or flow of economic value involving digital products and/or industries. Now that we have defined digital economy, it comes clear that the centerpiece to the definition is the identification of specific digital products and industries. The first thing we ask ourselves is what digital products fall within the category of or fall within the core of digital economy. We employ the narrowest definition of core digital products and only include those with the main functions of generating, processing, and/or storing digitized data. After assessing product classifications, we identified 5 core digital products, which were hardware, software, web publishing, telecommunication services, and specialized support services as a part of our core digital products. Now, 2 of the most common questions we get from this definition are, why don't we consider components and accessories that support digital goods and services, example semiconductors? It's because these are not considered main digital products as they cannot generate, process, or store digitized data directly. We refer to these as digitally enabling products. The second question we get is, why don't we consider goods and services that use digital products as components or accessories, example in car manufacturing industry? With car manufacturing as an example, this is not considered because, again, its main function is not generating, processing, or storing digitized data. We refer to these as digitally enabled products. I should stress, though, that the contributions of digitally enabling and digitally enabled products are still captured by our digital economy estimate through their economic linkages with the core digital products. I'll be elaborating how when we discuss our measurement framework. In here are the 5 core digital product groups which we just identified in the previous slide and the corresponding CPC version 2 codes of the exact products. Granted that we have successfully and objectively identified the digital products or industries in the core of digital economy, this still does not solve all the methodological challenges in estimating the size of the digital economy. The need for a uniform, harmonized, and comparable data on core digital products and services is integral to the proposed framework. Also, there is no one comprehensive global database for comparable cross-economy estimates. This is why I'll also highlight the data integration methods that we have employed in order to develop viable estimates of digital economy. The principal data source of our study are the National Supply and Use Table, the input-output tables that are published on its respective National Statistics Office website. For multi-regional analysis to compute global value chain indicators, credible inter-economy IoTs had to be used instead of individual national IoTs. For this, we have identified the World Input-Output Database, the WIOD, which has 56 sectors, 44 economies for years 2000 to 2014. We also identified the ADB multi-regional input-output data tables, the MRIOTs, which has 35 sectors, 63 economies for years 2000 and 2007 to 19. The WIOD tables include sectors that can be distinctively identified as core digital sectors. However, they only span from 2000 to 2014. The ADB MRIOT has data for latter years up until 2020. But core digital sectors are not distinct in its 35 sector classification. Given that we source data from various databases, 3 main concerns are considered to ensure uniformity and comparability of data. These were correspondence in classification systems, harmonization of SUT and IoT presentation format, and comparability in price and valuation. Given the varying levels of products and industry disaggregation that economies present in their SUTs and IoTs, it may be necessary to further disaggregate the data, especially those tables with less than desired level of detail. As an example, software publishing, a core digital product, is often combined with all publishing activities, and this needs to be extracted from total publishing activities. In this case, finding a credible data source as basis for disaggregating a product or an industry is a challenge. The table here lists the top sources of data from highest to lowest in terms of degree of reliability. First on the list are data extracted from the NSOs itself, as these are perfectly consistent with published estimates. However, when SUTs and IoTs are published at an aggregated level, more detailed data are not often publicly available. Last on the list is the use of a simple count of number of establishments as basis to disaggregate a product or industry. This is the last resort because it assumes that each firm's contribution to output is homogeneous. Here are the data integrated for each economy included in our analysis. As an example, for Australia, in addition to using the IoT published in the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the OECD we also employed data from Orbis to disaggregate sectors and we also employed data from Orbis and OECD to disaggregate sectors and specifically identified 4 distinct core digital industries. Further, for us to employ a longer inter-economy IO series, the ADB MR IoTs were disaggregated to identify core digital sectors that are comparable with the WIOD. This allowed us to integrate the two databases. We disaggregated the electrical and optical equipment C14 to identify computer, electronics, and optical products. We disaggregated post and telecommunications C27 to identify telecommunications and renting of machinery and equipment and other business activities to identify computer and ICT services. Granted that we have both defined the core of digital economy and ensured that the national tables across economies are uniform and thus comparable, we can move forth to discuss the measurement framework, the measurement method included in our framework. Our measurement framework is a value-added based calculation, and this is rooted in Leontief's input-output analysis. Using matrices from the NIOTs, we captured the digital economy by measuring the value-added contribution of an industry to the final goods production. This can be traced from the VBY matrix, which is the matrix product of the direct value-added coefficient vector V, total output requirements matrix or Leontief inverse matrix B, and the final demand vector Y. Our digital GDP equation is shown here, which takes specific components from the VBY matrix. It is comprised of 4 terms, where each corresponds to unique components of the GDP. To illustrate, let's assume that Industry 1 is the aggregate digital sector, and this is our resulting VBY matrix. Term 1 represents the first column of the VBY matrix, or the backward linkages, which refer to the interconnection of the digital sector with those sectors from which it purchases inputs, such as from electronic components, and can be interpreted as digitally enabling industries as discussed earlier. Term 2 represents the first row or the forward linkages, which refers to the interconnection of digital sector with those sectors to which it sells its output, such as to finance and insurance, and these can be interpreted as the digitally enabled industries also defined earlier. The intersection of these two terms needs to be removed in order to avoid double counting, represented by the third term. Lastly, we also captured the non-digital capital required by the digital sector because the capital goods produced by a non-digital industry and purchased by the digital industry also derived value from other industries in the economy. The entries concerned are represented by term 4. So we'll discuss the framework again at the end of the presentation when my colleague Jam will walk us through the assignment with you all. Moving on to the framework estimates, I'll be presenting the main results of our study, particularly our estimates of the core digital economy as a percentage of economy-wide GDP and our estimates of the digitally dependent economy. We applied the framework to 16 economies spanning several regions in Asia and the Pacific, North America, and Europe. We used current price SUTs and IoTs, attempting at least 2 periods for most economies, overall spanning 2000 to 2019. Digital economies estimates as a percentage of GDP range from approximately 2% to 9% In period 1, as per the yellow points, the digital economy of Singapore in 2000 and USA in 2010 constitute a significant portion of its economy by GDP. In the latter period represented by the blue points, USA and in 2019 and Taipei, China in 2016 had a sizable digital economy with respect to its GDP. To take a closer look at this, we divided the economy years in two groups, period 1 and period 2. In period 1, using level terms, the size of digital economy for USA leads by a significant margin, followed by Japan and People's Republic of China. In terms of share of GDP, Singapore had the largest share, followed by the US and Malaysia. In period 2, US in 2019 was still the largest digital economy in absolute terms, followed by Japan and India. In percentage of GDP terms, digital economy shares were still the highest in the US, followed by Taipei, China, and Malaysia. We looked at the compound annual growth rates of digital sectors between the two periods per economy, both in level terms and as a percentage of GDP. In level terms, as indicated by the blue color bars, all economies except Thailand exhibited a positive growth rate, with several economies' digital GDP growing more exceptionally than others. For example, if you see for India, Kazakhstan, and South Korea. Most economies' digital GDP as a percentage of economy-wide GDP posed negative growth rates, as indicated by the orange color bars. The largest downtrend is seen in Fiji, which is mainly due to a capital investment made by the digital sector in 2011, which was significantly lower in 2015. In Thailand, the significant negative growth rate is mainly due to a slight slowdown in manufacture of computer electronics and optical products since 2011. Disaggregating the digital economy by the four terms which were used in our equation, a major proportion of the digital GDP for countries like Fiji, Australia, and Denmark can be attributed to the forward linkages represented by the green bars or the second term in our equation. So these countries are acting as a supplier of value added to domestic non-digital sectors. Whereas countries like Taipei, China, Thailand, and People's Republic of China had a greater fraction of their digital GDP contributed by backward linkages, as per the blue bars, thus acting more so as users of non-digital sectors in the production chain. This is attributable to the presence of major computer brands in these economies, which naturally require various parts and components from different suppliers in the production chain. The concentration in digital economy by different subsectors is quite varied. Hardware comprises a huge chunk for Taipei, China, Singapore, and Thailand, while specialized and support services are relatively large contributors for Denmark and India. Telecommunications accounts for the overwhelming majority for Indonesia, Malaysia, and Kazakhstan. We also explored the roles that digital industries play in economic production, particularly the extent of digital products and technologies' value-added contribution to non-digital industries. We analyzed the forward contribution of digital sectors to non-digital sectors or digitally dependent sectors using three methods. First, using the forward linkages in our equation representing the contribution of digital sector to digitally enabled industries, we found that collectively the most digitally enabled industries are wholesale and retail trade, public administration and defense, compulsory social security, electronic, electrical and optical equipment, financial intermediation, and construction. Narrowing down our selected economies, this chart shows that Australia's finance, public administration, and trade sectors are most digitized, while Thailand and People's Republic of China, electronic and electrical sectors are most digitalized. Second, we applied the VBY framework to 10 sectors, identified as most digitally disrupted by OECD. These combined with our digital sectors allowed us to compute an estimate of the entire digitally dependent economy for each selected economy. This resulted in sizable share for each economy, ranging from 17% to 35% of GDP in both periods examined. The largest digitally dependent economies were those of Fiji, Australia, and Thailand. Fiji's was particularly high due to the significantly larger size of its accommodation services sector. Collectively, financial and insurance services accounted for the largest share of digitally dependent economy at an average of 7.1% of GDP across economy years, the highest of which was Australia's at 10.7%. In the previous analysis, forward linkages were used to identify and rank the digitally dependent sectors. Here we compute the depth of digitalization among these 10 sectors. The most digitally disrupted economy sectors were Singapore's and Fiji's travel agency, tour operator and other reservation services, followed by Malaysia and Denmark's gambling and betting services. And third, we looked at the ratio of intermediate inputs of digital products to total inputs to measure the extent of digital technology use in the economy. The direction of trends is similar to the economic size of digitally dependent sectors in the previous analysis. Remarkable increase in digital dependence is seen in Indonesia, driven mostly by changes in motion picture and related services, and in Thailand, driven by digitalization in education services. By sector, direct digital dependence across economies increased overall from period 1 to period 2, but this is not uniform across all sectors. Significant growth in digital inputs is observed in publishing and education, while finance and advertising sectors slightly eased in period 2. In general, across all analysis, we found that more service-oriented economies tend to have deeper forward linkages with the core digital economy, and digitalization in services is increasing. We also looked at the digital output multipliers, which gives the impact of a unit change in final demand for digital sector's output on the gross output of the economy. We compared the MRIoT based and NIoT based multipliers. The MRIoT based multiplier shows the impact relative to the global economy, while the NIoT based multiplier to the domestic economy. Using NIoTs, People's Republic of China had the highest output multiplier for hardware and information services. Using MRIoT based multiplier, People's Republic of China still led computer manufacturing, but Singapore led telecommunications and information services, which has an MRIoT based multiplier that is well above the NIoT based multiplier. MRIoT based multipliers are generally higher than the NIoT based because they nuance the sources of imports and destination of exports, thus allowing the calculation of inter-regional spillovers. Earlier, growth in the digital economy share of GDP calculated using current price NIoTs was negative for most of the economy studied. This result is attributed to the falling prices and growing productivity within the digital sectors across economies and over time. Using constant price NIoTs, the former was established as in volume terms, the digital economy as a percentage of GDP grew at a positive rate for all 5 economies examined. This points to decreasing prices coupled with increasing productivity of core digital products. We also employ a structural decomposition analysis to determine what drives changes in labor demand in the digital economy. Shown here are the results for India. It can be observed that over time, improvement in sector technology surprisingly increases overall labor demand in both India's core digital and digitally enabled sectors between 2010 and 14. This is in contrast with more developed economies such as the US, Germany, Canada, and Japan, where changes in sector technology contributed negatively to labor demand. With limited data, the results suggest that more investigation needs to be done to determine how improvement in technology in digital and digitally enabled sectors will affect employment. especially in the context of developing economies. Since about 2010, trade in digital products has risen steeply along global value chains. Global value chain indicators were computed using the 2000 to 14 WIOD tables and 2017 to 19 ADB MRIO tables. The evolution of the world average of total GVC participation of digital and non-digital sectors can be explained through 4 distinct phases. First is a phase from 2000 to 2003, when the gap between the total GVC participation of non-digital, as per the blue line, and digital, the red line, is minimal. Over this period, the total GVC participation of digital sectors declined as a result of the bursting of the dot-com bubble, while that of non-digital sectors marginally increased. Second is the 2003 to 2008 period leading up to the global financial crisis. During this period, total GVC participation of both digital and non-digital sectors increased as inter-economy production fragmentation proliferated. However, the total GVC participation of digital sectors never caught up with that of the non-digital sectors. This is possibly because GVCs during the early 2000s had been primarily shaped by trading in automotive parts, electronics, fuel, plastics, and synthetic rubber, most of which generally are non-digital in nature. Third is the 2008 to 9, the period of global financial crisis, where total GVC participation rates plunged for both digital and non-digital sectors. The last period is through the years 2009 to 2019, after the global financial crisis, when the total GVC participation of digital sectors grew faster than the non-digital sectors. This was driven by the emergence of novel technologies, including the Internet of Things, cloud computing, digital platforms, digital services, end-user devices, and other Industry 4.0 technologies. However, by 2019, amid the US-China trade tension, GVC participation of digital sectors declined more significantly than non-digital sectors, indicating that this trade tension disproportionately threatens the forward and backward linkages of digital sectors. We analyze the evolution of forward and backward GVC participation rates of 3 digital sectors as mentioned on the right in the 44 WIOD economies across the years 2000, 2007, 2014, and 2019. The forward GVC participation of digital sectors describes the exporting of intermediate products for a foreign economy's production, while the backward GVC participation of digital sectors describes the importing of intermediate products for its own production. In the figure shown, a general outward movement in points is observed from 2000 to 2007, from 2007 to 14, and 2014 to 19, implying a growing participation of digital economy sectors in GVCs from a backward and forward perspective over the years. From 2000 to 2014, the expansion of GVC participation among digital subsectors is significant in the manufacture of computers, as indicated by the spread of yellow points between the two periods. In this subsector, Ireland and Netherlands became increasingly more downstream in 2014, as you can see over here. Compared to 2000. Indonesia's manufacture of computers, meanwhile, shifted from being a relatively more upstream sector in 2000 to relatively more downstream by 2014. This is indicative of the subsector's greater participation in assembly tasks as well as its focus on consumer electronics, which are closer to final use. The PRC's manufacture of computers moved from being relatively more downstream in 2000 to more upstream in 2014, which is consistent with the PRC's economic rebalancing strategy that increased reliance on its domestic markets and reduced dependence on imports. It can also be observed that the expansion of GVC participation was more intense in the two digital services subsectors, telecom, as per the blue points, and information services, the red points, than just a minute. Yeah, than in the digital product subsector manufacture of computers. Similarly, we analyze the three digital sectors in the 62 ADB member economies and the rest of the world included in the MRIOTs for 2017, 18 and 19. This graph particularly highlights that the GVC participation of select Southeast Asian economies, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam and Singapore. On average, from 2000 to 2014, all three digital subsectors expanded both their forward and backward participation. However, the forward GVC participation of manufacture of computers receded between 2014 and 19. Meanwhile, the forward GVC participation of information services grew intensely, likely due to the more rapid trading in services compared to goods within the digital economy over 2014 to 19 period. While localization initiatives are underway for digital goods production due to US-China tech Cold War, thus causing its GVC participation rates to recede, trading in digital services is not as threatened by onshoring sentiments, possibly because it's not subject to import or export tariffs. Finally, a traditional trade and GVC activity of the digital sector can be analyzed in two perspectives, backward and forward. From a backward perspective, international trade and value added, that is TIVA, measures how much of the digital sector's final products are derived from foreign sources. And from a forward perspective, international TIVA measures how much of any economy's given digital sector value added is embedded in the production of commodities finally consumed abroad. From a backward perspective, as per the left panel, it can be observed that the level of TIVA via traditional trade was consistently higher than that via GVCs for all the years. This means that on aggregate, digital imports comprised more of final goods than goods used by digital sector as inputs to its own production. From a forward perspective, the complete opposite is observed, as the level of TIVA via traditional trade was consistently lower than that via GVCs. This means that on aggregate, digital sectors exported more of their output to the production of goods and services of foreign economy sectors than they exported to foreign final users. Additionally, it can be observed that the digital sector's GVC activity via forward linkages exceeds GVC activity via backward linkages in all years assessed, except 2001 and 2005. This further signifies how digital sectors generally take more of an upstream position in the GVCs. We conducted several other analyses as well, one of which is to look at digital in the time of COVID-19. Using the ADB MRIOTs, we estimated the overall changes in economy-wide GDP and digital economy from 2019 to 20, which resulted in a decline for most economies, likely due to the effects of COVID-19 on economic activity. However, Denmark, Taipei, China, People's Republic of China, and Malaysia saw increases in digital economy, as per the blue color bars. Coming to the conclusion of my presentation, our measurement framework provides a clear definition of the digital economy and measures the share of GDP attributable to it. That is, contributions to and from an established set of digital products in terms of value added. We were able to apply the framework on multiple economies using relatively simple data requirements, given that timely and detailed IoTs or SUTs are available. Application to real-world data provided insightful results. The total digital economy constituted a significant portion, 2 to 9% of every selected economy's GDP, and in 2019 represented about 8.8% of the global economy. With digital technologies taking distinctive roles in non-digital products as well, the estimated overall digital dependent economies range from 17 to 35% of GDP. From a multi-regional perspective, GVC participation of digital sectors grew from 2009 to 2019, driven by rapid trading in services. However, international trade tensions disproportionately disrupted the integration of digital GVCs from 2018 to 19. The COVID-19 pandemic is expected to exacerbate such disruption, although the depth of the impact is still subject to speculation. That's the end of my part, and we'll now move on to the next part where Jam will walk us through the assignment which was shared with all of you in advance. So I'll just stop sharing. Yes. Jam, over to you.
Right. So thanks Anurag for that very insightful presentation. Just for the copy of everyone, I'm gonna be sending in the chat the link to our report so you could also do the entire thing at your own time. So allow me to share my screen. Hold on.
I believe the participant would love to have a copy of the presentation as well, because there are many interesting points that we run through quite quickly.
Yes, definitely we will be sharing the slides. Anurag and I would be sharing the slides. But now I'd like to confirm whether my screen is visible.
Yes,
Are you?
I can see.
All right, so you see my slides. Okay. So, Witada may have sent to you already the files that we would be covering today. So those files would include Japan's 2015 IoT, which we post-process. Yep, so we downloaded Japan's IoT from its National Statistics Office's website, post-processed it a bit, and that's the data that we will be using in our template. Right? So, but before we get to the discussion of how to estimate the digital economy of Japan in 2015, let us first have a recap of the measurement framework which Anurag went over earlier. Okay, so here, yep. So the measurement framework, as you may have heard earlier, is rooted in input-output analysis. So this means that an understanding of the Leontief inverse is central to understanding how we estimate the digital economy, GDP. Right? So just as a recap, hold on, let me show my pointer so that there. Okay. So as a recap, the Leontief inverse, which is represented by the matrix B, gives the total output requirements from each industry in order to meet final demand for a specific time period. So therefore, in our methodology, we don't just measure the direct contribution of the core digital sectors on economy, but also its indirect contributions via its linkages. Again, so direct plus indirect contributions to the rest of the economy. So its linkages is formed as the digital economy is a user and supplier of products in the economy. Right? So because our measurement framework, as Anurag mentioned earlier, is value added based, we use the VBY matrix. So the VBY matrix shows the value added contribution of the digital economy to the whole economy. So this is a matrix that takes the dimensions of our input output table with the rows representing sectors, and likewise the columns also represent the sectors. Okay, so the digital economy can contribute either as a supplier of value added to non-digital sectors. So you can see that in this side here. So this icon, this cell phone icon, represents a digital economy. So as a supplier of value added, that's the forward linkage to the non-digital sectors, or as a user of value added of non-digital sectors, and that's represented by the backward linkage. So this chip right here is being used So by the digital sector, and that's the backward linkage of the digital sector to non-digital sectors, right? So looking further into this illustration here. So in here, the forward linkage, the core digital sector can supply value added to the car manufacturing industry by, say, supplying the smart components of the car. So the car manufacturer here is what was discussed earlier as a digitally enabled sector. So the core digital sector is enabling the car manufacturing industry. Therefore, it's a digitally enabled sector. Okay. Meanwhile, the core digital sector also uses value added from other sectors. Say in this illustration, we have here semiconductor or another component. And this sector is called a digitally enabling product because it is enabling the production of the core digital sector. Right? So the reason why we're including this is because without the demand for products of the core digital sector, the value added from digitally enabling sectors will not come to be. Right? So because digital sectors do not have a use for them if the digital sectors are not producing. So this is why it is essential to count these backward linkages as they are crucial in the production of the core digital products. Okay, so again, here is our core digital economy equation. So it just looks a bit daunting because of the letters that we have and the transpose symbol and the parentheses, but it's really just fairly simple. So in simple terms, the core digital economy equations just presents a way to extract from this VBY matrix the pertinent entries that can be traced as contribution of the core digital sector either through its forward and backward linkages. Okay, so similar with the illustration by Anurag earlier, let's also assume that sector 1 is a core digital sector. So sector 1 here is represented by both the first column and the first row. So zooming in the first term right here, this equation just simply takes the sum of the first column of the VBY matrix. So that's just simply taking the sum of this, right? So, and this represents the backward linkages of the core digital sector. In other words, this is the value added contribution of both the digital, so this is the contribution of the digital sector to itself, and the remaining terms here is the contribution of the non-digital sectors to the entire final product of the core digital sector. Okay, so that's the backward linkage. Let's move on to the second term. So the second term right there takes the sum of the first row of the VBY matrix. And as you've guessed it, or as you may have remembered, this represents the forward linkages of the core digital sector. So in other words, this row right here shows the disaggregation of the core digital sector's value-added contribution to the rest of the economy. So similar with the interpretation earlier, this is the contribution of the digital sector to itself, VBY11. Then this is the contribution of the core digital sector to sector 2, to sector 3, and so on. Right? So as you may have observed, that we are counting this term VBY11 twice. First in the first term in here and another in the second term. Therefore, to avoid double counting, we subtract it once from the core digital economy equation. That's why we have a minus sign there to avoid the double counting. So that's the third term. And finally, we get to the fourth term. This fourth term refers to the proportionate share in the backward linkage of the non-digital sectors from which the digital sector purchases capital. So that's quite a handful, or a mouthful rather. So let's try to digest that definition of the fourth term, because we also usually get some queries regarding the inclusion of a GFCF term. So let's have an elaboration of that beyond what was discussed earlier. Okay, so So the fourth term, as I mentioned earlier, is the proportionate share in the backward linkage of non-digital sectors that supply fixed capital to the core digital sector. So why should we include the fourth term? So I included here sort of a diagram on how to think about this, how to think about the transactions that necessitate the need for this fourth term. Okay, so first, the core digital sector demands fixed capital from non-digital sectors. So, for example, say computers, the manufacturing of computer sector, it may invest in non-digital capital, say furniture. Let's just assume that in its production, the computer manufacturing uses furniture, which is non-digital, right? And we see this investment by the core digital sector in furniture in the final demand side under GFCF, right? In the input-output table. So that fixed capital was produced as a non-digital sector output. In our example, it's produced as the output of the furniture sector in the production side. So we can see that in the production side of the input-output table. So the GFCF is seen in the final demand side, and the corresponding output that produced that GFCF is found in the production side. Okay, I hope that's clear so far. And the sector supplying this fixed capital to the digital sector. So in our example, that's the furniture sector. So the furniture sector, in producing furniture as an output, derives value added from the rest of the economy through its backward linkages, right? So the furniture sector needs to purchase inputs from the rest of the economy. So that's what we're counting, right? So what we are including in the digital GDP is the contemporaneous value-added contribution. So what this means is that we are just including the value-added contribution that occurs in the same period. That's why contemporaneous. So we are including only the contemporaneous value-added contribution by non-digital sectors in producing the output it supplies as fixed capital to the digital sectors. So the value-added contributions of fixed capital itself, for example, when it's consumed over the span of the given period, is accounted for in value added as consumption of fixed capital by the core digital sector. So I'll have a further illustration on the difference between those two components. But as a summary, the reason why we are including the fourth term is an attempt by our methodology to make the measure of digital GDP as comprehensive as possible. Okay, so here's what I was discussing earlier. So this is a sample input-output table. And suppose we have a disaggregation of our fixed capital. So just to show you the partitions of our input-output table, this is the production side. And then this is the final demand side. Okay, so in here we have just two columns for the GFCF. So this is the fixed capital of non-digital sectors, and in this column right here we have the fixed capital of the core digital sector. And this cell highlighted in green here can be interpreted as the capital investment of the core digital sector of the product of non-digital sector 1. Right, so for the sake of this illustration, let's assume that non-digital sector 1 is furniture. So this is the furniture investment by the core digital sector. So how is this connected to our production side? So in our production side, it could appear first in here and second in here. So in this green cell right here, this cell highlighted in green, that's where consumption of fixed capital appears. And since the value added row is already included in our VBY matrix, we have already accounted for this in our measurement framework. So what are we including in the fourth term? So it's not this one, since this is already included in the disaggregation of the value added of the core digital sector, but instead what we are including is the backward linkage related to the sector that produced the output that was invested in by the core digital sector. So this is what we are including. So the corresponding backward linkage of the non-digital sector. So the reason why we are not anymore adding this portion of the backward linkage related to the core digital sector is because including that would induce some double counting, since we are already including in our VBY matrix, if you recall, in here, we're including the entire first row and the entire first column. So there's no need to consider further the backward linkage of this sector to the core digital sector, because that has already been counted. And if we add that further, that would induce some double counting and we have to subtract that again. So just to save some time, we just add this up, the backward linkage related to the non-digital sectors. Okay, I hope that was clear. If you need some time to further digest the framework or this equation, that is included in our report, and we are also open for some queries. Just send us an email. Yes. So, okay, so we can now proceed with the exercise. So as I've mentioned earlier, we've sent to you the input-output table of Japan for 2015, and the goal of that exercise is to estimate digital GDP as a percentage of economy-wide GDP. Okay, so let's get to that. Let me share the the Excel. Hold on.
Let me ask the participants whether they have the Excel ready on their side as well. We have sent you the Excel that we will use with this exercise a few days ago, and you could retrieve from that and work together. Or if you cannot find that, Vanarat is emailing the Excel to you all again, so you can just check your inbox. It should be there right now. The same file that you have received a few days ago. I believe that ADB is using it for training only, so please do not circulate and not treat as the official data.
All right, so is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so
quite small. You have to enlarge. It's quite small.
Oh, okay. Hold on. All right. So this is the report that I've been talking about. This is what we've linked in the chat box. Anyway, going back, this is what we've sent to you. So what we've downloaded in the National Statistics Office of website of Japan are these raw files. So you can also see that here. But to save some time for processing of the data, as you may have recalled from Anurag's discussion earlier, we do some post-processing just to ensure that the data is consistent with how we define the digital economy, and also comparable with the time series IO that we have, and also with the rest of the economies that we include in our analysis. So that's the reason why we need to do some post-processing. So we did that. That's why we have this revised IoT tab here, and that's what we want you to use. Okay. So we also have right here the GFCF of digital industries. And again, this was post-processed. So Japan's NSO, or National Statistics Office, actually has a GFCF, or gross fixed capital formation. So GFCF matrix that includes the investment by the different sectors in the economy. But we've post-processed that again after downloading to map out the GFCF by the digital industries. Okay, so just again to save some time in doing the post processing, we already included here the post processed data. Okay, so all right, so in here I've already pre-filled the data. So if you have it open for you, we just need you to fill these out, fill the economy, just so if you're using this, you won't forget what you're estimating, what economy you're estimating digital economy for. So Japan, year 2015. So the IoT is in local currency, yen. So okay, it's not included here, but it's in yen, and the units is in millions. So we've also downloaded from the IMF IFS data the exchange rate between Japanese yen and the US dollar, so that we would have a dollar estimate of the digital economy of Japan. Okay? So I just want to walk through you through first the different sheets included in this template. So we have these sheets. The first is the IoT sheet, or the input-output table sheet. And in this sheet, we just want you to input the national IoT of the economy that has already been post-processed. So that's this sheet right here from the data source. So we just need to paste this in here. Right, so you have to populate the industries in here, the code in here, and then same with this one in here, the industries here, and the corresponding industry code in here. Okay, so that's what should be included in that sheet. So we also have a hidden sheet. So this is just for the sake of reducing the manual tasks we have to do. But this sheet the list sheet just lists down the digital sectors based on our tagging, and the non-digital sectors based on our tagging, which we will again do later. So this is just an overview of all the sheets. Right, so the second is the IoT underscore ag, or the aggregated IoT. So the reason why we are doing this aggregation is that so that we would only have one core digital sector. So if, for example, in the IoT, we identify more than one digital sectors based on the definition. So say we have 3 or 4 digital sectors that meet the definition, that meet our definition, we have to add all those together just for the sake of computational ease. So we add those, and then the Leontief here is just a sheet that computes for the Leontief inverse B. And then the VBY matrix, just a sheet that computes for the VBY matrix. The GFCF is used to compute for the 4th term. And finally, we have the summary sheet, which shows our digital economy estimates disaggregated by term. So we have here the 1st term representing the backward linkage, 2nd term, 3rd term, and the 4th term. And our results are right here. So you can see this is consistent with what Anurag has shown earlier in the charts. So if you recall, I hope you did, Japan in 2015 had a digital economy size of 5.9 as a percentage of economy-wide GDP. Okay? All right. So let's go through the entire template. Okay, so as I've mentioned earlier, what we have to do in this IoT template is to just paste the IoT that we've post-processed. So that means pasting this column in here. Let me make this bigger. All right, and also this column and the corresponding codes in here, and the contents of the IoT in the contents of the IoT in here in the template. Okay, so as you can see here, we have the different sectors that are in Japan's IoT. And then, hold on. And then we have a single vector of final demand here. But final demand is actually comprised of different items. So we have items corresponding to where's that? There. So we have items corresponding to final expenditure of households, final other private consumption, consumption of general government, and also our gross fixed capital. Okay, so we just simply added all these columns up to get the final demand. And that's represented by a single vector in here. So that's our input-output table, and that's the first step that is required to populate this template. So the second step is to tag the core digital sector. Um, so we have to go through the products or the sectors one by one to determine whether that sector we are looking at um, complies with the definition of a core digital sector based on our framework. And if it's not, then we just have to copy the code. So crop cultivation, obviously it's not a digital sector, so we just copy this code. So we have to browse some more. So production machinery, it's not a core digital sector, so we just have to copy this code. So browse, and here. So we have electronic computing equipment and accessory equipment of electronic computing equipment. So that meets the definition of our core digital sector because it has the main function of storing, processing, and processing digitized data. So we have to tag that with D, representing digital. So we have to do that again for the rest. And we have here communications or telecommunications. And again, that's a core digital sector. Information services, again, a core digital sector. Internet-based services, a core digital sector. And that's about it. So until we get to activities not elsewhere classified, which not primarily digital, office supplies not digital, and yes. So we've already tagged the digital sectors um, in the rows. So the sector in here, and we have to just do the same tagging in here. But since our IoT is just symmetric, we can just simply copy this to here so that um, we save some time. But as you can see here, electronic computing equipment is tagged as digital, and then the same for the rest. Okay? All right. So that's for the first step. And then this list here will just automatically get from here what we've tagged as D and lists here the digital sector. So we have 4 core digital sectors in Japan, and the rest are those not tagged with D are the non-digital sectors. Okay? All right. So let's move on. All right. So if ever this sheet right here, IoT underscore aggregate, or rather, if your IoT is longer than this one, so our IoT has a number of 110 number of rows. So if, for example, the IoT of another country you're using, say, has 200 rows, so you just have to adjust the formula by copying that formula and extending the dimensions of the table. Okay, but here I've already done that. I've already filled the cells that require filling just so we don't miss out any cell in our original IoT table. So I've done that, and what this IoT sheet does is that it adds up all that we've tagged as D here. So it adds up this, this, and this. So it adds up that row-wise, and also adds up this, and this column-wise, right? So that's what this sheet is designed to do. So all transactions of the core digital sector, of the 4 digital sectors that we've tagged earlier, is already summarized as a single column and a single row in here, and the corresponding transactions with other non-digital sectors. So this is already the summarized table. And now that we have this, we can already start computing our digital economy estimates following this equation that we've shown earlier. Okay, so let's compute for the Leontief inverse. So the Leontief inverse requires first the A matrix. So the A matrix, just as a review of our input-output analysis concepts, is the technical coefficients matrix, and it's simply just a matrix that represents the input share from the gross output. Okay, so let's try to do that here. So first we get the Z matrix. So the Z matrix is simply just the intermediate consumption matrix in this in our aggregated IoT. So the intermediate consumption can be found here. I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but just for the sake of illustration. So the intermediate consumption matrix is this one here, from that first row there up to here. Here rather. And this is already our final demand, so that's not part of intermediate consumption. Right, so this is intermediate consumption, and that's the Z matrix. So we just link that here. And yes, that's already the Z matrix. Okay. The next is the Gva vector. So the Gva vector is again this one, just this one. Oops. Just this entire row. Okay, so that's our gross value added. That's it. And then we have our, so this is this apostrophe here is just a symbol for transpose. That's which represents a row vector. So that's a Gva row vector. This here is X transpose, or our gross output row vector. So our gross output is simply just this one. Okay, so we just get that entire vector and link that here. All right, so the next step is to compute for the V vector. So the V vector is simply just our value added coefficients, and that's derived by simply dividing the Gva vector by the gross output. So the Gva ratio is in here in the first sector, 52.98 or 0.5298. In the second sector right here, that's 0.5456, and so on. So we do that for the entire row. Okay, so we already have our V vector, and that would form part of our V hat for the VBY matrix. So to get the V hat, we simply just diagonalize that vector. So if you recall the figures earlier, we have the 0.5298 in the first diagonal. In the second, this one, we have the 0.5456, which is the second cell or the second entry in our vector earlier, and so on. So we just have to put the vector, the row vector we had earlier, in the diagonals, and the rest would be zeros, right? So that's just how we diagonalize a matrix. So we already have the V hat, so the V for our VBY matrix. So next, let's derive the B, or the Leontief inverse. As I've mentioned earlier, central to that is the A matrix, or our technical coefficients matrix. And simply, that's just getting the ratio of this input here, the first input right here, by the gross output. Right? So we do that for the rest of the entries of the Z matrix. Okay, so I hope that's clear so far. So we already have our A matrix, and our B matrix, or our Leontief inverse, is just derived by getting the inverse of I minus A. So in matrix notation, that's like this one, B is equal to I minus A inverse. So I believe there's a note in the template that we've sent to you that includes this formula. And fortunately, Excel can now do matrix operations, and that operation can be seen in this formula right here. M inverse just gets the matrix inverse, and then this formula here just creates an identity matrix, which is I, and this here, B117 to DA220, is just the A matrix. So we have now, right here, the Leontief inverse. A very, very important matrix for our analysis. Okay, so we now have V hat, we now have B hat for our VBY. What's left for us to do is to get or derive the Y hat matrix, or the diagonalized Y vector. So the Y vector is simply the final demand in our aggregated IoT, and that's simply just this one. Right, so that's the reason why we already add up the entire final demand, because we just need a single vector of final demand for a VBY matrix. We don't need this aggregation across household final consumption, non-profit institutions, and government, and so on. So we just need that, link that here, and again, diagonalize the entire vector. So we have here a Y hat matrix, which just puts the final demand vector in the diagonals to form this matrix with zeros in the off-diagonal entries. All right, so I hope it's still clear so far what to put where from the IO. So now that we have our V hat, our B, and our Y hat, we can now create our VBY matrix, which again is central to our methodology. So what our methodology does, this equation does, is just selecting what to add up. Right? So if you recall earlier from the VBY matrix, we get here the first term, the backward linkage, the first term, or the backward linkage, or the first column, that's the backward linkage. The first row here is the forward linkage, and the intersection is the double count, since we count that from both the column and the row, or from both the forward and the backward linkage. And that's what's in here. So if we trace this to here, that's the first column, the backward linkage. And if we trace the second term, that's this row, or the forward linkage. And then from the summary sheet again, the double counted term, or the 13576, is just this one, the double count. All right, so we now have the first, the second, and the third terms. And as if you recall earlier, we also included the foreign exchange rate so that we could convert the yen, million yen to $1 million, and we have that here. Okay, so let's now move on to the measurement of the fourth term. So the fourth term relies on our determination of how of the type of investment the digital industries invests in, or the type of capital that the digital industries invest in. So in Japan, we have determined these. So they invest in here, wearing apparel, lumber and wood products, furniture and fixtures. So we've simply just gotten this from their NSO website and post-processed it, right? So we have these. We have these GFCF. So we just aggregated the rows so that these digital sectors are added up: communications and information services, internet-based activities, and this one are added up. So we have here an aggregated GFCF vector of the digital industries GFCF. And what we do is we get the ratio between the share of GFCF in final demand. So we just, for example, here, divide this 1577 by the final demand of the core digital sector, which is 22,246. So we just divide this by this, and then same goes for the rest. So the capital invested on this by the digital sectors by the final demand of that. So wearing apparel, so that's this one. Simply just divide by the corresponding final demand, and we get the R vector. So what we do is just get the diagonalize the share of GFCF in final demand, and then multiply that, or post multiply that R hat by the VBY. So that's the VBYR. As you can see in here, you have the VBYR. So that's the VBYR matrix, which gets the proportionate share of the GFCF of the digital industries in the VBY. Okay, so we have that. But if you recall earlier in our elaboration of the fourth term, we no longer need to include the backward linkage from the digital sector itself. So we are excluding those highlighted in yellow in the VBYR matrix because that would constitute double counting it. And simply just getting the sum of those that we did not highlight, or the backward linkage of the non-digital GFCF. So the figures here relates to wearing apparel, if you recall. And then we have here the furniture, if you recall, and so on. And that would represent the backward linkage of GFCF of digital sectors. Okay, and that's what we link here, 3819485. And converting that into dollars, we get 31556. So adding that all up, or not really adding, so first term plus second term minus double count plus fourth term, we get the total digital GDP for Japan. And then here is the economy-wide GDP, which we also just derived from their IoT. It's just that we get the digital GDP as a percentage of economy-wide GDP, which is 5.9. And that's it. That's how we derive digital GDP as a percentage of economy-wide GDP for Japan in 2015. So really our methodology, this represented by this equation, is fairly simple. I believe the challenging part really is in harmonizing the data that we have, because usually, especially for developing economies, input-output tables are somewhat aggregated. So the challenge there is to split some sectors up just so we can identify what proportion of a certain aggregated sector corresponds to the digital sector. So that's really the challenge, much of the challenge in our methodology. Are there any questions?
I have a question about the disaggregation of sectors that you just mentioned. Yes. I observed that you disaggregate it from 35 sectors, and then now we have more, right, to split that up, digital one. Will this newly disaggregate sector will appear in IO structure from now, or this is just for this exercise?
Right. So the 35 sectors that you're saying is from the MRIO, right? So we actually have a digitally disaggregated version of the MRIO. We have that for 2017, 18, and 19, but I believe we don't have those tables published in the ADB MRIO website, which Arvin shared earlier. But we did some disaggregation just so we could make an analysis for the digital sector only. So this data that we have that I've shown earlier for Japan actually came from their National Statistics Office. So it's not from the MRIO. That's why it's highly detailed. It's from their NSOs. What we have in the MRIO is a 35 sector, and what we did to the MRIO to create some GVC analysis and other multi-region analysis or inter-country analysis is to disaggregate the MRIO to show specifically the digital sectors. Joseph?
Yes, Jam and Vitada, just to add to what Jam said, in fact, our objective is to produce far more disaggregated MRIOTs, right? Right now, if you look at the WIOD, I think they produce at 56 sector level of disaggregation, and the latest OECD table is at maybe 45 sector disaggregation. So our objective is certainly over time to get to 45 and 56 and maybe 64, right? But given the size of the MRIOTs and the lack of detail that we have on an individual country basis, it's a huge challenge. So we are looking at about 3 to 5 year horizon to increase the detail. However, as Jam mentioned, for this specific purpose, and for us to keep the digital economy estimates statistics up to date, we will disaggregate some tables to show specific sectors related to the digital economy. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Joseph.
How many countries that you have covered on this digital exercise?
So when we disaggregated it for all the countries that are currently in the MRIOT, right? So that would be 62 countries plus rest of the world. So we could do that exercise for the given years, the years for which we have the tables disaggregated. We could do this exercise for all the countries in the MRIOT, including, I believe, 25 countries from the region. So that's only for the MRIOT. However, if for countries that have disaggregated national input-output tables, any country, right, we can use the methodologies to produce this estimate at a local level. So there are a number of ways to do these calculations. Again, it is all data dependent.
Okay, thanks.
All right,
thank you very much.
Thanks.
I see questions from Shujat.
Well, thank you, Chair, for the opportunity again. My first question is to from the presentation of Anurag, that how you're going to define the digital sector, because he was more focusing on the hardware part, and perhaps there was a software part missing. And second question to Jam, that while looking at the developing countries and developed countries, what should be the level of disintegration in the data? Because somewhere in the developing part of the world, data might not be that much significant enough. And as far as the variables are concerned or indicators are concerned, some of the data might even be missing. So how are you going to tackle with these things? Thank you.
Right. Anurag, would you want to go first or all right, go ahead. You're muted.
I'm just sharing my screen once again. So we have created 5 core classification of the digital products, which are hardware, software publishing, web publishing, telecommunication services, and specialized and support services. So I think your question was, how are we capturing the software components of the digital products? So that would be captured in one of the items we are creating over here, while hardware comes as a separate item in the digital products category. Jam, would you like to add to that?
Well, Anurag, my apologies for interrupting here. But hardware part will be mostly focusing on the good side. Why not be just on the digital or services provision? Perhaps I would like to elaborate that from there is some gap in between the services sector and the goods sector, which I found missing here.
How do you define? What do you mean by a gap?
Well, gap is that in services sector, the trade or the exports or the data is much more different in comparison to that of the goods sector. So this is what I meant by gap.
No, I still don't get you. The point is there are only two things. There are right. One is a good and another is the service. Now
Yes.
the service is completely captured in what we defined there.
Okay.
And the goods
Okay.
is also completely captured in what we defined as hardware. So there is no hybrid sector here.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for clarification.
All right. Go ahead, Jam or Anurag.
All right. So to answer your question, allow me to share my screen again. I believe your question to Anurag and me is quite related. So let me go back. Oops. Am I already sharing my screen? Can you see my slides?
Yes, Jen.
All right. So, oops. Okay. So it's exiting. All right. So I would just like to highlight that this is the core definition. So the reason why Joseph said that there's no overlap. So we just run by this definition. So to identify the core digital products and industries, we just have to determine whether the main function of that good or service is the generation, the processing, and the storing of digitized data. That's the reason why we have hardware here, particularly pertaining to computing machinery, disks, tapes, and the rest of these data, is because it falls within this very strict definition. So it's not the entire hardware per se, but just these products. Same with software publishing, just these specific products, and we have the services here: web publishing, telecommunication services, and specialized and support services. Okay, so given that, your question was that how do we use a highly aggregated data, say from a developing economy? So we have these sources, so these options to disaggregate a highly aggregated table. So first, we use data from National Statistics Office. Perhaps they have some very specific data just related to digital economy there, so we can perhaps use some as disaggregator, if I may call it that, disaggregator. Perhaps there are also some relevant journals, and others. So for our methodology, we have these data sources. So Anurag mentioned this earlier. For say for Australia, they have 114 industries in their input-output table. But then there are some aggregated sectors. So what we did was to check data from the OECD and the Orbis, which would help us disaggregate the 114. So from the 114, it increased to I'm not sure if 116 or so, but we identified 4 digital industries in there. And then let's look at more. Say so here, say India. So India, their input-output table just has a dimension of 56 industries. So Australia has 114, possibly because their data collection method are more sophisticated. And the same with Japan, as our example earlier. India here has 56, so it's quite aggregated. So what we did was, again, to lean on other sources, such as Orbis, and also their statistics office, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, in order to narrow down the digital sector based on the definition that we had earlier. So we have these other sources. So if we find a very aggregated table, we must look for other supporting data sets, such as what is written in here. So from the NSOs, journals, perhaps you have a supply and use table, so we could use a supply table, operating revenue data from credible data sources such as Orbis, data from a donor economy. This is quite more tricky because it's difficult to find a donor economy with a similar economic structure to what to our desired economy that we're estimating for. And also, we could also use a number establishments from credible data sources. But again, this is as well tricky because it's very crude just using the number of establishments. Right. I hope I answered your question. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, it's fine, Jam. Go ahead.
Okay. I can't find the hold on.
Let me ask if there is other questions or not from the floor. Then I see no questions from the floor. So I would like to thank you very much, the ADB team led by Joseph and the speakers Anurag and Jam for this very interesting sessions. I believe that our participants will go back and watching the video carefully, including working on again on the Excel that you just show us, and probably they will have more questions coming up later. So I would be happy to facilitate post sessions questions from the participants to ADB team if we have received from them. So with that, we are going to take a few minutes break and then come back at 2:45. Now I see Tavia. Hi, Tavia. We are running a little bit late in this session, so we are going to have a few minutes break and then start at about the same time that we planned. So yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. So thanks again, Joseph, Anurag, and Jam for the insightful discussion. I will be in touch. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Vitada, for this opportunity and the opportunity to continue to collaborate. And hi, Javier. Nice to see you again. All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll catch up soon. Bye.
Yep. Hi. Hi, Thanos. We will have a short break for a few minutes, and then we will come back at about 2:45.
Sounds good. Thank you, Vitala.
Thanks. Bye. Hello. Welcome back to the sessions. If you are here, please let me know. Okay. Hi. Hi. Good afternoon, my side. Good morning, your side. So, so we have Sylvia and Janos from OECD as our special guests for today. We are going to talk about digital trade, which is very important components before COVID and even more components now with the COVID and after. This talk is related very much to ESCAP and OECD collaborations, which has run more than a year now on digital trade regulatory analysis. We have collaborated with OECD, which, as many of you already know, have conduct digital trade service digital service trade restrictiveness index and service trade restrictiveness index as the flagship measurements on service regulatory analysis. And also they conduct regulatory impact analysis, which is also interesting assignments as well. We focus on digital trade issues in this workshop, but I'm sure that what we discussed in this workshop cut across many other regulatory areas that also related to different components of GVCs and trade in general sense as well. I think many of you know Xavier. He has many interesting publications related to GVCs and now more and more on digital economy issues. He is from Trade and Agricultural Directorate of OECD. Right, I think recently many of his work focus on trade in digital era. He developed framework for analysis of digital trade, including the context of exploring what market openness mean for the 21st century. Janos is also from Agricultural Directorate of OECD, specifically on Trade in Service Division. He is the trade policy analyst and work and specialize specifically on service trade. He involved in the OECD Service Trade Restrictiveness Index and manage the annual updates of STRI. So if you have been a fan of these components and publication of OECD, you are very much welcome to ask a lot of questions in these sessions. Please, Xavier and Janos, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Witada, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, both Janos and I. What we'll do is that I will start with sort of some broad brush observations on some of the opportunities for digital trade and talk to you about data flows. And then Janos will take over with some more precise discussion of some of the challenges. I'm going to share my screen. I hope that you can hear me properly. Just two quick things on what Witada was talking about. I did do a lot of work on GVCs, and just to lighten the mood, I tend to think that digital trade is the new GVC trade. So I'll leave you with that as a kind of a thought. Going forward, digital trade is changing a whole new or bringing a whole new set of issues, and this is what I want to start with, trying to convince you that digital trade is different, and that while we had GVC trade where we reduced coordination cost and we had a lot of intermediate goods trade, with digital trade, what really has fallen is the cost of sharing information. And so this is changing what and how we trade. It certainly means more traditional trades. So, what we used to do just better through reductions in trade costs. But it also means more digitally ordered parcels. And we're very familiar with this, particularly during lockdowns, because that's how we've sort of provisioned ourselves of the goods that we needed. But from the business side, it has provided a lifeline for SMEs and also single traders to be more directly connected to international trade than ever before. Now, it's also about much more digitally delivered trades. This includes new services, intermediation services, but also computer services, and also smaller value services, such as the ones that we might consume via applications in our phones, which tend to be delivered through new technological platforms. And last but certainly not least, it's about more bundled or smart products. And sort of these are products that combine the characteristics of goods, of services, and which are constantly connected. I'm talking obviously about the smart speakers, about smartphones, about IoT. We tend to put the word smart in front of them. What's interesting is that they combine these three elements somewhat seamlessly. And so what all of this implies is that more and more data is supporting international trade and crossing international borders. And this, of course, raises a range of new issues. Now, I think one way of trying to identify what some of these issues might be is to try and dig into some specific transactions. So what I have here is what we might call an Uber transaction. And so what I want you to do is to forget this whole bit over here at the top. But in the olden times, we used to have a consumer that would hail a taxi or a car, and all the transaction will take place between the consumer and the driver. And now what we have with digitalization is the creation of a new transaction, which is an intermediation transaction, which can be provided across borders. And so one of the first implications of digitalization is that we have more visible transactions. What happens now in an Uber transaction is that the ride-sharing platform deals with the money, deals with providing a matching service to the driver and to the consumer, and that transaction is traditionally supported by the movement of data. And again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, data becomes extremely important, and that data is now, in this instance, crossing an international border. And the third element I want to highlight is that in this type of transaction, the type of service that is being provided across borders is not entirely clear or becomes a bit more difficult to classify. So clearly the ride-sharing platform that we have here is related to a transportation service, but the ride-sharing platform does not own any taxis or any cars. It provides what might be known as an intermediation service. So which one is it and where do we classify this? And of course, this matters for measurement, but it also matters for the rules that apply because we've made commitments on different types of services internationally. Two other transactions I want to highlight to identify some of the challenges. The first one is a hypothetical 3D printing transaction. So looking on the left side, this is where a business sends a design file over the border to a consumer, which prints it, and then it becomes a good. So this flow of data and this design service, when it crosses the border, is actually that. It's a service, but when it reaches the consumer, it's a good. So the question, quite validly, is what is it? Is it a good or is it a service? Again, it matters because of the commitments that have been made in international trade. It matters because of measurement, and it matters for a whole range of other issues. And the other thing that it raises is what border does it cross? If I can move data quite easily from one place to another, then it's not necessarily the place where I receive the data from, which is the place where the data or the value has been created. So it blurs certain distinctions that we thought were quite obvious. The other transaction that I want to highlight is a hypothetical social networking transaction. So this is, maybe a Facebook transaction or something like that. And so what we have here is a consumer that is providing some data to the social networking platform and receiving a networking service. Now, what's interesting about this type of transaction in this type of platform is that there is a decoupling of the payment. The consumer doesn't pay the platform, it provides its data, and then the platform, the social networking platform, leverages that to sell an advertising service to a business. And that's where the flow of funds comes in. And so what's happening here is that in platforms, we sometimes have this decoupling of payments, which is endemic to multi-sided markets. By multi-sided markets, we mean that there are many different markets operating at the same time. And again, this border over here, we've placed it in this example here, but it can also be in different places as well. And so it's important, again, to think about what is the service and what is the money that is crossing an international border. So having highlighted some of the emerging challenges, let me turn to some of the opportunities for trade in the digital era. And this is work that we've been doing from some econometric analysis. This particular graph is from some work we've done with Janos and I have done in 2018. But one of the key observations is that digitalization is not just about ICT sectors. Digitalization means more trade in goods, it means more trade in services, and more trade in parcels. So this, what you see here on your left-hand side, is basically a gravity model estimate, which identifies the impact of increasing digital connectivity between two countries by 10%. And what you see in the goods side is that it is the more complex manufacturing goods which tend to benefit more, but that all goods benefit from digitalization, from all goods in terms of exports. In terms of services, we see a similar issue, that we have the digitally deliverable services, which are the ones which tend to benefit more from digitalization, but again, all services benefit. And last, we recently did some work with another colleague on trade and parcels, and we find that the 10% increase in bilateral digital connectivity with other countries is associated to a doubling of the effect on parcel trade. That is, that where on goods it's around 2%, with parcel trade is about 4%. So it's important across the board, but there are some areas which might be more important than others. The second observation that I want to highlight from our econometric analysis is that digitalization allows you to reap more benefits from trade agreements. So again, this is a gravity model. We identify your traditional impact of FTA. So having an FTA increases trade by 19 or nearly 20%. We have an average increase in digital connectivity effect, which is 2.2%. Remember, that's an average of increasing digital connectivity by 10%. But when we interact digital connectivity with the FTA, we find a statistically significant impact, which suggests that digitalization allows you to make more out of the preferences that are on offer from your FTAs. The third area I want to highlight is that digitalization gives rise to new relationships between goods and services. So we know from a lot of work that's been done in the past that services are really critical for goods. And we've spoken, and this new word has come up, servicification or mode 5. So we know that a lot of services goes into manufacturing activities. But what we did in this work is that we tried to see whether the opposite relationship would hold. And we found that goods, or in particular ICT goods, were important for digitally deliverable services or digitally delivered services and smart products. So this is the result of a regression. And what we see over here in particular is that when we interact the minimum internet use with ICT good imports, we find a statistically significant relationship. Again, showing that you need goods or ICT goods in order to digitally deliver services. And the last area in this part is that we recently did some work on 3D printers and 3D printing and international trade. And we also find that there are interesting relationships that are emerging. In particular, we find that growing use of 3D printers increases goods trade. So again, new relationships emerging, and not necessarily in the direction where we think, because some people thought that it would increase services trade, but we find that there was a relationship with goods trade already. The fourth area I want to highlight is that digital technologies increase the export propensities of firms in developing countries. And so this is the result of a regression that is a cross-sectional regression. So the economists among you might think that, of course, cross-sectional can have some problems because it shows you correlations rather than causations, but it still provides information suggesting that there is a premium to using digital technologies such as websites in order to increase export propensities, and that premium might be higher for smaller firms than it is for larger firms, as is shown in this slide. The last area I want to highlight in terms of the opportunities relates to stories that you might have been hearing earlier about GVCs, and that is largely about how access to digital inputs, which can be digitally deliverable business services, can increase export competitiveness. And so what I'm showing here is a result from an econometric analysis that shows you the impact of increasing imports of digitally deliverable services inputs on export competitive, on exports of high income, upper middle income, and lower middle and lower income countries. And again, we see a positive impact throughout, but importantly, the impact is higher for lower middle and lower income countries. And what this tells us is that essentially the impact is higher because in lower middle and lower income countries, there are less domestic or fewer domestic substitutes for countries to draw on, which means that developing countries tend to rely a lot more on trade than high income countries to access their digital inputs, which is why trade really matters and digital trade really matters in this instance. So having spoken about a lot of the opportunities and sort of painted a relatively rosy picture, let me turn to some of the challenges, and in particular the challenges related to cross-border data flows. Now, as I've said earlier, today's world is underpinned by the movement of data. It helps us coordinate our value chains, it helps the smaller firms access global markets, and it also changes how goods and services are produced and also delivered. And so it's increasingly difficult in this day and age to identify an international trade transaction that is taking place without some form of cross-border data transfer. But the issue is that, like digital trade, data is different, and there are significant benefits from enhancing its use and reuse. And so when you think about data, it's instructive to use this sort of pyramid of analysis, which sort of allows you to think about how bits and bytes translates into dollars and cents. Data in itself has no value whatsoever. There's a lot of it and it's unstructured. It's only when you start extracting it and trying to make it as information, and then using that information to create knowledge, and then using that knowledge to have action, which is the wisdom part, that data starts having value. But what is very new about data is that, unlike what we've learned in global value chains where an intermediate good gets fed into the process, the intermediate good in a manufacturing process gets consumed as the product is produced, whereas the data can be used to support many different products. So the data itself is non-rivalrous and is also easily shared and easily copied. So you can support a lot of value generation on the basis of the same type of data. So that pyramid, that bottom of the pyramid, can support a lot of economic activity. And so what this means is that there are very important and increasing returns to scale and scope from sharing data, including across borders, and particularly because data varies across borders, and that provides new insights that might not be available from local data. But what we are seeing is that the pervasive exchange of data across borders is fueling a range of concerns about how data is being used, but especially how data might be misused. And this is leading to a range of new, what I'm calling here, data policies. And I'm referring here to two types of policies. The first one are conditions on the transfer of data. And the second one are conditions on data that has to be stored domestically, something that's known as local storage requirements or data localization. And there are many different reasons why you want to regulate data, and data often applies differently to different types of data, whether it's private information, whether it's important data, whether it's telecommunications data. But the reason why this is being developed is reflecting a number of objectives. Much of the debate today is about personal data protection, and it's about rising concerns about privacy and what happens when you send a piece of data across border and it's not receiving the same safeguards that it receives domestically. But there are also other objectives, such as those for data localizations, which are to meet regulatory objectives such as access to data for audit purposes. So essentially, this is, for example, I've got accountancy data in my firm, and the tax inspector needs to come and review it. So I ask that data is located domestically, or there is telecommunications data that needs to be reviewed by the telecommunications authorities. There's also, of course, reasons related to national security, protection of information which might be deemed sensitive, but something that we are seeing more and more of is that there are reasons to regulate data which are more nefarious in that they are about digital industrial policy. And it's this idea that data needs to stay domestically so that we can exploit it within the confines of our economy rather than sharing it out. But to better understand the emerging landscape, it's useful to provide an overview of the different regulations that are out there. So we've done a lot of work in this area, and we've come up with sort of these 4 different types of approaches. The first approach is where there's no regulation whatsoever. And what we're seeing here is that this is the approach of many developing and least developed countries in particular. And the issue here is that while data can presumably move freely, many countries are reluctant to send data to a country that has no safeguard for it. So this is problematic. And also many countries that are in this bucket here are going to have to choose a new type of regulation, which brings me to my second approach, which is ex post accountability, or what might also be called open safeguards. And these are approaches where the private sector has a relatively strong leeway in terms of enabling the transfer and ensuring that the transfer is safeguarded. This is the approach of the US, countries like Canada or Australia, many APEC countries. The third approach is what we might call flow conditional on safeguards or pre-authorized safeguards. And this is an approach that is much more closer to the EU. You may have heard of the GDPR. And this happens where the country chooses whether a transfer or whether another country is adequate to protect the data, and then the transfer is enabled. And in the absence of that adequacy decision, data can be transferred via certain tools such as contractual clauses. And then the last type of approach is the flow conditional on ad hoc authorization. And this tends to be on a much more ad hoc basis in terms of the authorization requirements. It's not clear how, it's on a case-by-case basis, and it tends to apply to ill-defined categories of data, such as important or sensitive data, with wide discretion of what is important and what is sensitive. Now, the issue here is that this is leading to a big patchwork of regulations, which is creating a lot of challenges due to complexity. Mainly the challenges for governments and individuals, where there's a lot of uncertainty about what rules apply in what situation. But for firms too, it's increasing the costs of engaging in trade, and also of allowing them to understand what type of protection they have to offer to what customer in what particular destination. So what we've identified in some subsequent work is that there are different ways, different instruments to enable data flows with trust. And here you have a list of them. They are unilateral mechanisms, which relate to the ones that we just spoke about, which are just domestic approaches. There are plurilateral arrangements, and you may have heard about the OECD privacy guidelines, or the APEC CBPR, which are binding arrangements. There's also increasingly a lot of action in trade agreements, where you increasingly have binding provisions on data flows, which also include provisions in e-commerce chapters on privacy. And last but not least, there's standards and technology-driven initiatives, which relate to the use of privacy-enhancing technologies or standards which may enable the transfer of data to be safeguarded. Now, making progress in this issue is very difficult because of the range of policy objectives that are trying to be met. But what's important is to recognize that countries approach this in all these different ways, and that there is no one way of doing this correctly. But we can build on what makes us common in order to try and identify better ways of making the instruments interoperable. The matrix that you have on the right is basically a heat map of the bilateral overlap in privacy and personal data protection regulation. And it suggests that even though we are very different, there are a lot of commonalities on which we can build on. And the aim is that we build on those commonalities to facilitate further convergence and instruments that are much more interoperable. I'm going to leave it at that and pass it on to Janos. Sorry for taking a bit longer.
Thank you, Javier, and hello to everyone. Let me start also by sharing my screen. It is a great pleasure for me as well to be here, and I would like to also thank the organizers for inviting the OECD to this event. So Javier just concluded his presentation on some of the challenges related to cross-border data flows. And I would like to pick it up from there, but focus a bit more on the regulatory environment and some of the challenges related to it. And this is important because, as many of you know, effective trade policy making really depends on the quality of the evidence. So regulators really need to know exactly what the issues are. For instance, where market failures need correcting, where trade barriers inhibit access to better and cheaper goods and services, or where inefficient competition regulations provide too much market power to a few companies on the market. So there is great value in understanding where the challenges lie, especially when we are trying to regulate the digital economy, and being able to compare to other countries to understand the existing best practices, and identifying common solutions is of particularly great value. So in my presentation, I would like to discuss the OECD's work in this domain, and I will focus on three main points. First, I would like to talk to you about the OECD's Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index and some of the joint work that we have been doing with ESCAP. Secondly, I would like to also present another OECD tool that looks at the existing international instruments that govern digital trade. And finally, I will provide a few concluding points to sum up the presentation that we have had so far. The OECD has a long-standing work on measuring barriers to services trade, and more generally, the services trade environment. The OECD STRI, which stands for Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, was launched back in 2014, and it is an instrument that is comprised of two important parts. One that is a regulatory database that collects information directly from the laws and regulations of countries that relate to trade barriers. And it has a common framework across all countries, which allows easy comparability and looking at kind of the same issues across all countries. Currently, we have 22 different services sectors, some of which are at the forefront of digital trade, such as telecommunications and computer services. And the second component is the indices that derive from this regulatory database. And it is really a translation of the regulatory information from the databases into a quantifiable indicator. These indicators range between 0 and 1, where 1 indicates the most restrictive environment. Since the STRI covers a lot of the information, a lot of the barriers that are also relevant for digital trade, we developed a function, an additional tool, which is the digital STRI, because there was already a lot of information that we collected in the standard STRI that paint the picture in terms of what are some of the horizontal, some of the cross-cutting barriers that affect any type of digital activity. So that was the rationale behind developing a separate tool, and that is the digital STRI, which provides this horizontal overview in terms of the most important barriers that affect any type of digital trade activity. In terms of coverage, the STRI has 50 countries now, and in just the coming days, we are planning to add 24 new countries to the existing online tools, and more will follow in the coming weeks. And this is thanks to the collaboration that Vitada mentioned at the beginning that we have been had with ESCAP, as well as other UN economic commissions that allowed us to expand the country coverage for the digital STRI and for computer services STRI among the 22 sectors. And this allows us also to have a broader perspective on different countries' regulations, particularly for developing countries. So I would like to present some of the, very briefly, some of the key messages that we have from these tools. And first, I would like to start with giving you a global picture in terms of the regulatory challenges on digital trade. So here you see the digital STRIs for the countries that we have now. And what you see particularly is that The regulatory approaches across countries are very diverse. Some countries where the index level are low, that indicates a more open regulatory environment, whereas countries that have a higher index level, those tend to have a more restrictive trade environment. So if you look at the countries, really there are very different approaches, and the countries that have the lowest index values, such as Canada or Costa Rica, the gap between them and the countries that have the largest index value, such as Kazakhstan, is really huge. And that just shows the gap that currently exists in terms of differences on regulations. If we zoom in a bit to the ESCAP region, which was part of the work that we have been doing, what you see is a very similar picture in terms of difference between the lowest and the highest index value. But here we also look a bit at the different contributors, the different dimensions of the index, and particularly looking at 5 different policy dimensions. One on infrastructure and connectivity, that looks at barriers related to telecommunication services, data flows. Another one on electronic transactions, payment systems, intellectual property rights, and one that's looking at all the other barriers, such as commercial presence requirements or performance requirements, and so on. So what you see here on the regional level is that there is a very important contribution for measures related to infrastructure and connectivity, and I will come back to that in the next slide. But you also see a bit the time dimension and the time dynamic in terms of regulatory changes over time. If you look at the red dot, which signifies the regulatory measures as they were in 2014, you see a very dynamic change over time across countries. Only a few countries have not changed their index value over time, but a lot have either gone up, which means they become more restrictive, or have gone down, which means that they become more liberal. So if we focus in a bit more on the contributors, here I put both the digital STRI contributors as well as the computer services contributors, because these provide very complementary pictures in terms of what are the current regulatory challenges. So as we saw in the previous slide, for the digital STRI, the key components, the key challenge remains with respect to communications infrastructure, particularly finding the relevant pro-competitive regulation, finding the right ways to enable cross-border data flows. Those still remain a challenge across the region. The second most important challenge that we identify under the digital STRI relates to this other category, which often includes the requirement to have some sort of local presence, or includes some sort of limitations on content-related services and other barriers that provide for a tighter environment. And if you look at the other side on computer services, we see that the policy dimensions are different. We look at 5 different kind of policy dimensions, namely restrictions on foreign entry. Here we look at particularly measures related to investment-related barriers. For instance, limitations on foreign equity, conditions related to setting up a company from the start, foreign investment screening related measures. So all that relates to mode-free supply, for those of you who are familiar with the different modes of services supply. And under computer services, this is the most important share of the outcomes, the most important share of the contributors. About half of the total index values relate to this type of barriers. And we also see another complementary dimension to computer services, namely related to barriers to movement of people. And as many of you know, it's very important that when we talk about digital trade, to also talk about the movement of essential IT professionals across borders, because they are the ones that are needed to install new IT equipment, to provide the training on how to use them, and also to repair and maintain them. So enabling the movement of IT experts, and also think about programmers or computer engineers, what we see through the lens of computer services is that there's still a lot of conditions attached when it comes to the ability of these persons to travel across borders. Just briefly to mention, the other dimensions for computer services relate to other discriminatory measures. Here, particularly, we look at barriers to public procurement, taxes and subsidies, barriers to competition, where we look at the competition regulatory environment and access and remedies related to anti-competitive behavior. And lastly, we look at also barriers to regulatory transparency, which is an essential feature that is necessary for any firm that is trying to access a new market. In terms of the evolution of regulations over time, as I mentioned, one of the key benefits of the STRI approach is that we have an annual data point and we update the data every year, which provides us with a very nice insight as to how the regulations evolve over time. And here what you see that for both computer services and the digital STRI, the regulations have gone up on average, which means that the regulatory environment has become more restrictive over time. But interestingly, it is more restrictive for digital STRI. And that's particularly, as I mentioned, the digital STRI looks a bit more at the cross-cutting issues and covers particularly cross-border supplies. So that tells us that particularly the regulatory environment affecting all type of activities, all type of digital activities that are delivered across borders have become more restrictive over time. And lastly, let's look also at the regulatory similarity. And while digitalization enables a lot of cross-border trade, what we know is that the rules that govern these activities are very much limited by borders. And the STRI approach or the STRI methodology is a very unique tool that also allows us to assess how similar or how different countries' regulations are from each other. And this is what we call regulatory heterogeneity. And this is a major source for international firms that want to trade across border. It's a major source of trade costs and limitations for them. Just very briefly, so the STRI database allows us to look at the same type of issues across countries. So it is very easy for us to just take two of these databases and compare the answers. And this is exactly what we do, so that we use that approach to generate new kind of heterogeneity indices for country pairs. And then we can compare those across the whole spectrum of countries to get a sense of where countries are more similar or more different in terms of their regulations. And one way to visually present that is through the network graphs that you see here. So the knots on this figure show the countries, and the color intensity shows the centrality of the country. So the darker the shade of blue, the more central countries are, which means that more countries are similar to it. And also you see the arrows that point from one country to another, indicating the country to which the originator is most similar to. So in very simple terms, what you see on this slide is that there's a very different kind of heterogeneity when we look at computer services and when we look at the more cross-cutting issues represented by digital STRI. If we look at computer services, we see that there's much more diversity among the region. We see that particularly across countries, there is less connection, there is less shades of blue, and there's a lot of countries on the margin, and usually there are a few on the very edge that are not similar to pretty much anybody else. And that shows that when it comes to the broader set of regulations that involves investment, movement of people, procurement, regulatory transparency, and other issues, the scope of divergence among the ESCAP countries is quite large. And then if we move on to a bit more the cross-cutting issues, for the which is represented by the digital STRI, we see a bit more groupings of countries, particularly two groups, one on the north, one on the south. And here you see more similarities between kind of countries, particularly kind of a set of countries that tend to be a bit more centered around countries such as Japan or Thailand, and on the south you see a bit more some of the smaller ASEAN countries being grouped together. This is what I wanted to tell you on the STRI work, and let me move on to the second point that I wanted to raise, which is to present you another OECD tool that we have recently developed in order to map the international regulatory landscape for digital trade. And this tool is called the Digital Trade Inventory, which is a very powerful tool that provides an overview on the rules, standards, and principles that underpin digital trade. And it was developed in a way to match the current issues that are being discussed at the WTO in the context of the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. Simply put, this is a very useful tool. It serves as a single window that provides users with the broad overview in terms of what are the international instruments that affect digital trade. And it's very transparent for policymakers to navigate through these different instruments. And what we discovered through this tool is that the landscape is quite complex. There are more than 52 instruments that are currently developed in 24 different fora. And while we know that the level of bindings of these instruments can vary, one important conclusion was that we see a growing consensus on a lot of the issues that these instruments govern. For instance, when it comes to electronic transactions, trade facilitation, or market access for telecommunications and goods, we see a certain consensus being developed. There's also a high degree of complementarity between these different instruments, and they also cross-reference each other. And another important point is that the inventory also demonstrates that countries have made commitments on a number of issues that matter for digital trade discussions, including through their RTAs. And if you think about the opportunities that Javier presented earlier on in terms of the importance of RTAs in terms of benefits for digitalization through raising digital intensity between country pairs, it makes sense that more commitments lead to more benefits for digital trade. And also in the context of the GSI discussions in Geneva, the inventory shows that there is a good basis for international instruments upon which these discussions can build, and countries can leverage already the existing commonalities that we have identified through these instruments. The digital trade inventory also comes with some useful tools that provide a very intuitive way for users to get a sense of what is this, how this environment looks like from a global perspective. You can also look at it either by country, or you can also look at it for issues that relate to countries' commitments in RTAs. So there's basically these two instruments. So here you see the one that looks at international instruments, and the other one where you look at countries' commitments in RTAs. I put the link below each of these instruments, and I believe that you will receive the slides. So feel free to click on them and to explore and see how these can be of use in the context of your work. And I'm slowly moving to my third and final point. So what does this all mean? And what I would like to do here is to go back a little bit to the points that my colleague Javier raised, because in our presentation, we really tried to present you a lot of different work, a lot of different ideas. What we really wanted to try is to paint you a broad picture on how we see digital trade today, where we see the opportunities, also where we see the challenges. We started from the premise that digitalization has made trade policy more complex, and digitalization also makes it more difficult to apply some of the traditional trade concepts, frameworks, and rules that we used to know and used to be familiar with, because digitalization changes a lot of the underlying ways in which we trade, and blurs some of the existing lines. But there's also a lot of good news. Javier mentioned about the benefits of digitalization across all different sectors, the benefits of raising digital connectivity between countries and in the context of FTAs. And there's also good news because there are a lot of issues where we see a growing consensus, growing commonalities, particularly when we talk about commonalities on cross-border data flows. And there's also good news because a lot of these can feed into the ongoing discussions at the JSI in Geneva. And just a few days ago, there was an important conclusion of another JSI discussion on services domestic regulations in Geneva, which shows not only that there is possibility for the WTO to conclude these kind of discussions, but it was also very important because services domestic regulations also play an important role when it comes to enabling more transparent regulations, easier licensing for any kind of business, including for digital businesses. So last point from my side, I don't think I say anything new when I say that the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted really what are the benefits of digital trade and made us appreciate more what digitalization can do. And I think also governments around the world are working hard to leverage this momentum to create more digitalization through the economies. So in this context, I would like to leave you with a few points on how and where trade can play an important role in this objective. First, we know that trade can help to keep the costs of digital communication down through access, more access to the internet, cheaper access to the internet, and more incentives to invest in better infrastructure. Trade can also help to make the devices that we use cheaper by lowering tariffs, for instance. And trade is also relevant in the context of the online goods that we order, whether through more facilitation of more logistics networks, customs procedures, but also to access to consignments that have a lower value. And lastly, trade also helps to secure access to better services and enables more digital solutions. And one of the good examples here is to look at how much digitalization enables the substitution of some of the activities that we used to do. For instance, now we're using Zoom to provide a lot of services before we used to travel a bit more. So what I would like to conclude with is that digitalization will be a key towards economic recovery, and how trade policymakers will leverage this opportunity to improve the existing conditions will be very important component. We need better global rules, and we need to take advantage of this opportunity. And I think there is a lot of momentum both nationally and internationally to make that objective possible. So I leave it at that. Thank you very much for having us, and with that I pass the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Javier and Janos. This is very interesting. I have few questions. But I don't want to steal the time of the participants. If you have questions, please raise your hand or drop in the chat box. And while I'm waiting for your question, I will ask my question first. First is about terminology that I often receive the questions from public, right? We often say digital trade. When some people say it's e-commerce, how would you distinguish these two terms, or you see it as the synonym of each other?
Perhaps I can come in. So historically speaking, there are various definitions for e-commerce. I think, and I might be wrong about this, but I think that the OECD was one of the first definitions of e-commerce, and the definition was largely in the context of ordering. So an e-commerce transaction would take place when the ordering process was in some way digital. In 1998, when the WTO started discussing these issues, they also provided a definition of e-commerce, which related to the ordering process, but delivering process, and broadened what e-commerce might be to a new category of issues. What has raised in popularity in the last few years is the notion of digital trade. And one of the things that I guess the short answer to your question is that digital trade and e-commerce in the WTO sense are analogous to each other. But people refer to digital trade to separate themselves from the original idea, but also to think more carefully about new issues that it raises, such as cross-border data flows, which fit a bit strangely into the notion of e-commerce. E-commerce largely relates, when we think about it, to whether it's a good or whether it's a service and what's crossing the borders, whereas digital trade might also include the notion of cross-border data flows. The way that we think about it in the OECD is a bit different. We define digital trade, but we think that it's most important to think about the components of digital trade, to think about whether it's a digitally delivered good or a digitally delivered service or a physically delivered good or a physically delivered digitally delivered service. So we think that it's more instructive to decompose the different elements of this rather than to refer to very broad elements. But what is really important is to make sure that at least the notion of digital trade includes goods and service and includes some things that can be physically delivered or that can be digitally delivered. I think you're muted, Witada.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Javier, for the answers. Let me open the floor to participants. I see hands from Sumit.
Thank you for this lecture. So it seems that digital trade would be impacted more by domestic regulations, while if you talk about e-commerce, it is about cross-border services. So do you think that competition policies then would be impacting more of digital trade rather than e-commerce? Thank you.
Witada, do you want us to take that straight away, or are we gathering questions?
Let me ask Johanna as well. He also have questions. Probably it's related. Johan.
Thank you, Witada. Hi, Xavier and Janice. Thank you for the presentation. So I have a question about the new cutting-edge modes of digital trade. You mentioned first the 3D printing, and you also mentioned some smart product that using IoT technologies. So I was wondering how should we go about capturing the regulatory environment for these two modes of digital trade? Should we look at the regulation of services such as data, and at the same time the regulation of goods such as tariffs, or should we find some unique way of looking at those two modes of digital trade? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think it's a good question. Let's answer these two questions and then see what else coming from the floor.
Okay, maybe I'll start first of all with Samesh's question, and maybe specify that, and I'm going to share my screen very quickly. It's a slide that I actually took out at the very end. Janos will know which one I'm talking about. But when we talk about digital trade, we don't talk about the entity itself. And I guess what I mean is that it's useful to differentiate different elements of digital trade. So whether it's a service or whether it's a good, whether it's digitally delivered or whether it's physically delivered, and what the digital trade enablers are. And e-commerce and digital trade, as it's defined by the WTO and as we defined it at the OECD and other places, relates to all of this, basically, where data flows are a bit of a strange animal. because data flows support international trade transactions. So we're not saying that, one impacts one and one impacts the other, but rather that, these are different elements and that we need to consider a whole range of things. Now, related to the impacts about domestic policies and other types of policies, which is sort of ancillary related to the second question, it really depends. So if you have a sort of a physically delivered goods that crosses an international border, you will care about the domestic regulations and services and logistics. So if a parcel is coming towards you cross borders, the logistics services, the courier services, the transportation services, all of the domestic regulation in that will matter for the costs that you have to access that particular item. And this is true across a range of things. What we're saying as well with one of the slides that I presented is that if you care about digitally delivered services, so this category over here, not only do you need to care about the domestic regulation, but you also need to care about access to the devices that enable the consumption of these digitally deliverable services. So in this paper that I shared in the chat that we wrote with Janos, we sort of highlight that one of the issues is that in the digital economy, the amount of measures that you need to care about are cumulative. And so you need to care about, even for goods, you need to care about service measures. Even for services, you need to care about goods measures. And we have a sort of a pyramid in this paper, or an iceberg, which highlights what are the issues. And this is sort of related to the second question that you've asked. So in terms of 3D printing, and in terms of the Internet of Things, one of the things that digitalization does is that it blurs these distinctions. So for 3D printing, we really don't know, to be honest. Like, there are areas which are quite difficult to tell, because if a 3D printing transaction is considered to be a service, then what you care about are the prevailing conditions in the context of what commitments you've made on services. But if it's a good, then of course it raises, what does it pay a tariff? Does it come under de minimis and therefore not subject to customs duties? What type of NTMs does it have to face in terms of technical barriers to trade and other such things? So it really depends, and these are issues that we need to sort of start sorting out, and this is why we're looking at sort of these new rules of the road to be updated. And it's the same thing for the Internet of Things. I mean, it doesn't necessarily raise issues that are unfamiliar. We have had bundled goods and services in the past, but now it's a bundled good and service that requires a data policy. So we need to think about, if you're accessing the access to the good, the access to the service, but now in addition to that, we need to think about, what type of restrictions there might be to send personal data. Imagine that this is a smart speaker, and that smart speaker is sending an order to a platform that is located abroad. So that regulation there might be considered personal information, and therefore might require thinking about how that fits into issues related about market access. Maybe Janos wants to also say a few things, but it's a really interesting case that we need to solve these issues in order to take advantage of the new opportunities.
Thank you. I think Javier already replied to all the questions and had very similar replies that I wanted to give. I think just one point to add from my side is that really I think the regulations on the services side are becoming really complex to understand. And one of the results, or one of the causes of this, is exactly what you pointed out, Johan, in terms of the blurring lines between what rules apply to goods, what rules apply to services. 3D printing IoT is a good example, but I think also if we look a bit more like to classical but easier, simpler devices like smart devices, the smart speaker that Javier mentioned, really services are the way to give means to these devices. So if you just have a smart speaker at home, but you're not having any services related to it, it's not going to be of any use. It's the services component that really make this a useful and valuable tool. So again, another good example is your smartphone. If you don't have any access to banking services, Netflix, content, anything, it's just going to be a piece of brick, basically, but it's not going to be useful. It is the services that matter. And as a consequence of that, all the regulations that are attached to data flows, content-related regulations, consumer protection, all those regulations become relevant when you're trying to trade these services. So again, it's a very complex environment that I think will need to evolve, and I think there is a lot of discussion around this at the WTO at the moment, and certainly some space that is worth watching for.
Thank you very much.
If I may, just to add, this online platforms and your information like Uber has all this information about your visits to different places. So what you are facing is a situation wherein your information is put on the platforms and probably is being used by the vendors for their own research. So then, as you said, there are a lot of data privacy issues. There are issues related to data sharing. So I thought that competition policy, domestic regulations were more relevant in this context, because in India there's a lot of discussion on online platforms, whether it should be Alibaba or it should be Amazon type, wherein you host both buyers and sellers, or if it is like Alibaba type. I mean, I'm sure, if we debate and discuss, I think things will move forward. Thank you so much.
Just let me say that that's a really good point, and I think that you're right. What we are saying is that essentially this is something that what's happening at home can have broader implications and more implications, particularly in a world where the internet is global but regulation is domestic. And so I think this is the point that Janos was trying to make to a certain extent. And I mean, for us, the real challenge, I mean, when we think, and we're sort of international trade people, so we're wearing that international trade hat. But if you have a privacy regulation at home domestically, it's already difficult enough. But what is really, really complicated in this area, and the data flow stuff that I was presenting, is when you have a desire that if you are a citizen of a particular country, that when your data moves outside that country, that it is afforded the same degree of protection that it is afforded where you are domestically. And so the challenge in that side becomes about trying to make sure that domestic regulation is interoperable and that the transfer mechanisms that exist are able to attain those goals, because you can either have two goals in mind. You can have the goal that you want that data protection to be extended to the individual, but some countries might also be using this as a way of saying, well, actually, we want the data to stay domestically so that we develop these services ourselves. And that would be more of an industrial policy. And so the real difficulty here is to marry the different policy objectives, but to ensure that at least these measures are applied transparently, that they're non-discriminatory, and that they remain least trade restrictive, so that we can enable those opportunities that we sort of enumerated at the beginning of the presentation. And maybe on competition policy, I can let Janos say a few words, but that's also a difficult issue.
Definitely a difficult issue, but I think it's a very important one, because Somesh, I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of the importance of enabling competition environment in addition to lowering trade barriers. I think those two go hand in hand, because what we see is that increasingly, there's basically a global market where only maybe a few companies tend to have more market power than others. So it becomes very important to have adequate competition rules that make sure that there is a fair regulations, a level playing field for all the other players on the market. So what we know, for instance, in telecommunication is that typically in network industries, there is a need also to have ex-ante competition regulation to make sure that potential anti-competitive behavior are addressed, particularly for big companies. How does that work in the digital sphere? I think that's still up for discussion, but I think it will be one of those areas where a lot of more discussions will need to be made in order to understand better exactly how regulators should address the challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me check in the chat. I don't see questions in the chat, and there is no hand. I have a small question just from my curiosity on how do you define whether it is trade or trade restrictiveness or does equal restriction. I mean, because some regulations is affect not only foreign companies but it's block even the domestic firms. How you capture this as part of STRI or you exclude it based on it has to be discriminatory impacts?
Maybe I can take that one. So it is true that we capture both sides. On the one hand, you have the trade barriers that affect how you access the market, particularly think about quantitative restrictions on licensing, for instance, or other type of market access barriers. But then once you are on the market, one of the challenges, particularly for services, is that there can still be barriers behind the border. And understanding those is very important because it's not enough to get access to the market. You also need to have a fair opportunity to stay on the market. So in the STRI, we take that into account. We look at behind the border measures. For instance, I mentioned measures related to regulatory transparency, which apply equally to domestic and foreign entities. Also, competition policies is another good example. So once you enter the market, but there's anti-competitive behavior, you need to have an effective mechanism to address that. And that applies to both domestic and foreign ones, which is trade enhancing overall. So the STRI takes into account all these nuances and all the relevant implications for behind the border measures as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me ask for another time from the floor. Would you like to ask any question, please? No. Then I think that's it, and it's very useful presentations and also the questions, discussions today. I believe that participants probably want to ask more questions after they read all the papers that you have shared. And I would be happy to facilitate bringing the questions back to both of you. I would like also to emphasize that this is not the last sessions because the participants still have to work on their self-study, and we have 2 self-study modules of today's topics, which is one on the STRI from OECD, and the other one is based on ESCAP, Regional Digital Trade Integration Index, which is a tools to measure regulatory restrictions in Asia Pacific regions as complementary tools that you can see together with the STI, and then that we will summarize our analysis in the publications to be released quite soon. With that, tomorrow we would have Janos again from OECD, and his colleague Irene will join us to discuss the exercise on the STRI, and myself with team will discuss the exercise on RDTII with you. If any of you haven't look at the materials, I encourage you to spend the rest of today. This is a lot of materials to work on after this, actually, and then we have a fruitful discussion tomorrow. I thank Javier and Thanos for very useful sessions today, and I will be in touch for further collaborations as well as bringing comments and questions from our participants to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Wutada. Always a pleasure, and for the very challenging and useful questions from the audience. Take good care. And feel free to contact us for anything. We're always around.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much from my side as well. See you tomorrow.
See you. Bye.
All right. Thank you.